Hi Year 13, this lecture's about gender and crime. Why do you think that it's always really ugly women that seem to play the part of the criminal in the media or film industry? Why do you think that might be?
So data from official statistics and self-report studies on offenders, okay, so think self-report is a different research method that can make up for the deficiencies in relying on official statistics. These show that women commit fewer crimes than men, that women commit less serious offences, and women are actually less likely to re-offend. So have a think about what sorts of offences do you think women are commonly arrested for, or Frances Heinsohn, we've looked at before. She argues that women do not commit crime because of patriarchal control. And she actually adapts the control theory to explain why women are less likely to commit crime. She argued that the control of women by men discourages deviance by reducing their opportunities to offend. And she said that women are controlled in 3 places: at home, in public, and also at work. Sorry, that seems to have cut off the bottom of your PowerPoint. Can you annotate on your PowerPoint how they are controlled in these 3 separate areas?
Frances Heinsohn argues that the reason that women do not commit crime is because of control theory, in particular patriarchal control. She argues that men dominate women, okay, and women are controlled in 3 different spheres: at home, in public, and, sorry, it's been cut off, in the workplace. And on the next slide, I've annotated as many reasons that I could think of for control at home, public, and the workplace that you can add to your PowerPoint. And all of these combine to reduce the opportunities that women have to commit crime itself. So as a result, they're less likely to commit crime in the first place. Just to recap control theory, it's a theory that humans act rationally and conform to social norms in return for rewards. People will commit crime if the rewards for conforming aren't good enough, or the rewards of the crime outweigh the risks. It's a branch of right realism. Pat Carlin wrote about class and gender deals, and she argued that women only commit crime if their class or gender deal has been broken. She did some research in prison. She interviewed female convicts to try and figure out what was it that led to them committing crimes. She argued that the class deal offers rewards from hard work, while the gender deal offers rewards from their roles as wife and mother. So why do you think working class women are less likely to benefit from these types of deals? So why don't they get rewarded from hard work? And why might they not get rewarded as a role as a wife or a mother? Okay, so consider how hard they might have to work for very low pay, and the fact that they're more likely to be victims of domestic violence. They're much more likely to be lone parent families. So if they don't get the deal, then they're more likely to commit crime. There are a couple of criticisms to make of Heinsohn and Carlin's approach. Both feminism and control theory are overly deterministic and ignore the role of free will. And don't forget, Carlin's sample was far too narrow. She only focused on working class crime of women and, like many feminists and other structural theories, ignored white collar crime. Frida Adler tried to explain why some women were starting to commit crime, okay? And she argued that as men and women have become more equal or more similar, women, as a result, are taking part in crimes that were typically associated with men. So In what ways are women's lives now more similar to men? And how might this explain an increase in female crime? She pointed out to women taking part in male crimes such as embezzlement and armed robbery. Now, embezzlement is associated with a work-related crime, so what social changes have gone on for women to embezzle. And a more recent bit of research, because Frida Adler, 1975 was quite a long time ago, Denscombe found out that teenage girls were concerned with looking hard and so adopted male behaviour to join certain gangs. Criticisms again. Adler overemphasises the extent women have been liberated and the impact this has had on their involvement in crime. Apparently, most female criminals are working class, and they are least, and the working class are the ones that are least influenced by feminism or liberation. And generally, women did deal in drugs, but this was linked to prostitution, and prostitution is a crime that's dominated by male pimps. So women are not liberated, they're actually further subjugated by men. And Laidler and Hunt challenged Denscombe's findings and said actually the female gang members tended to conform to conventional gender roles. So they would have sex, they would, with all the male members, they would dress a little bit revealingly. They would play the weaker roles in the gang, the spies, so they wouldn't get involved in the physical fighting side of the gang behaviour. The other focus is victims. Now, this is where many feminists in crime and deviance focus their work. And there's a horrible statistic that 1 in 3 women in the world will be raped, killed, or beaten. Okay, it's called the 1 billion and rising statistic. If you Google 1 billion rising video on YouTube, there's a great clip to look at that talks about the sorts of abuse women suffer. Carol Smart argued that feminists should be very concerned with the harm that women suffer as a result of crime. The British Crime Survey in 2008 showed that 5.7% of men and 3.3% of women aged 25 to 34 have been victims of at least one violent crime in the previous 12 months. What difference do you think there was between the violent crime that men were victim to and the violent crime that women were subject to? Men are much more likely to be victims of a violent attack by complete strangers in public spaces. 78% of victims of stranger violence were men. Why do you think this is? And it's something to do with where they spend their leisure time. Women are much more likely to be victims of violent attacks by someone they know in their own home. Okay, so what sort of circumstances might lead to that? And what's interestingly, what picture does the media paint of where we're more likely to become victims of crime? And does the media try and create a sense of fear against stranger danger as opposed to the people we spend all our time with? We can focus on domestic violence. We did look at this in the family unit last year. The majority of crimes against women are carried out by men and include the use of violence. Again, here's some horrible statistics. If you remember, Dobash and Dobash explained domestic violence in terms of an extension of patriarchal control in the home. It was arguably something to do with the marriage ceremony, where the woman was seen as the man's property. And if at any point she challenged the male authority, maybe over bills or what he was spending his money on or disagreed, that was when they'd assert their patriarchal control by using physical violence because their financial control may have been slipping. Okay. What's key to know is crimes against women are subject to severe and significant underreporting. Why do you think women are unlikely to report violence against them that's committed by people that they live with? Why? You can't talk about women as victims without considering the case of rape, as awful as it is. In 2001, the Home Office reported that 1 in 20 women between 16 and 60 had been raped and 45% of those had been by their current partners. Now remember, it wasn't until 2001 marital rape was actually outlawed in Britain, which is a real shocking fact. What's terrible about rape as a crime is the conviction and sentencing rate is so enormously low. Most of the time it's because victims actually withdraw their account and withdraw their charges because they are so scared of being not believed and of the criminal justice system. Now, I know we spoke about this in lesson, but when it comes to rape trials, it's normally one person's word against the others, and the man's lawyer will try and paint the woman as behaving as sluttily as possible and possibly asking for it, which is a really horrible experience to go through, especially if your friends and family have turned out to support you in court. Arguably, rape has nothing to do with sexual desire, but about asserting power and dominance and toughness. These are all very masculine characteristics, possibly linked back to the socialization argument that we started off with. And Susan Brown-Miller argues that rape is part of the male system of intimidation of women and keeping them in fear and controlling them. So the other side of the argument is, why are men more likely to be involved in crime? Now, Dick Hobbs, if you remember, we looked at him when we looked at the labelling theory, symbolic interactionism and crime, because he was interested in binge drinking and the moral panic around it. And he did a lot of research on the nighttime economy. And he argued that the reason that men were more likely to be involved in crime, particularly young males, was because there were greater opportunities for them to misbehave. And a lot of their offences were linked to alcohol. He argued that bouncers' use of violence had become legitimised, but in a very informal context. Now, postmodernists would be very interested in this idea, the idea that actually the management of crime is shifting away from central agencies like the police and moving into less formal agencies like bouncers and taxi drivers and the sort of people that haven't got any authority, but they are starting to manage people's behaviour, particularly in the drunk nighttime economy. James Messerschmidt argued that there's something called normative masculinity that men need to work at, okay, the idea of what a real man should be. So he argued that businessmen can achieve masculinity in the workplace by dominating their female workforce. However, when a man has no power at work, possibly has a female boss, he might try and re-establish his normative masculinity in the domestic situation through things like domestic violence. Okay, going on, he actually talked about middle-class boys, and he said that middle-class boys actually achieve at school, but have to go through a process of emasculation. They have to give up their masculinity to behave in class and do well. At school, they adopt accommodating masculinity, but they make up for this outside of school by engaging in oppositional masculinity, engaging in pranks, excessive drinking, and of course high spirits. Okay. But their crime is generally non-utilitarian crime, okay, crime with no economic benefit. Messerschmidt also argued that working class boys are constantly in oppositional masculinity, both inside and outside of school, which is much more aggressive in nature, tends to be more physical, and tends to be involved in a wider range of criminal behaviour and deviance. Bob Connell argued that young black males get sucked into a property and violent crime as a way of enhancing a hegemonic masculinity, so their male dominance within the family, within the neighbourhoods. And lots of this is supported by, remember if we looked at Tony Sewell, and he said that black boys become socialised into like a ghetto subculture reinforced by the music and the fashions they follow. This is backed up by Messerschmidt, who also argued that rape and pimping are sometimes used to express control over women, particularly within gangs. Aggressive masculinity. So men can express their masculinity through criminal behaviour, such as fighting, football hooliganism, etc. But they can also express their masculinity through playing competitive sports, such as rugby, okay? B. Campbell argued that young men seek to compensate for a lack of breadwinner status, a crisis of masculinity, through aggressive masculinity. And this is the idea that we were talking about earlier on, about the feminization of the workplace, okay, female managers over male workers. All of the forms of masculinity adopted involve control over things like technology, such as stolen cars, control over public space, the streets, and violence against the other, okay, whether it's things like Asian shopkeepers or women. And all of these things are all about reasserting male control. Katz, who's a postmodernist, argues that many criminologists have failed to ignore the enjoyment or the pleasure of committing crime, and many football hooligan groups, for example, will actively pursue opportunities to get into fights with other football gangs. The search for pleasure is meaningful when equated with masculinity's stress upon status and control over others and success. So if we accept that men gain status over being successful and gaining control over others, and therefore we can understand why they might engage in physical violence. Violent crime can be seductive and can be undertaken for the chaos, thrill, and potential danger. Now, what I'd like you just to consider is to compare Katz's theory with Walter Miller's focal concerns theory of excitement. And here are some AO2 points that you might want to annotate. Thank you, Year 13.